June 24th, 1812. The Niemen River, on the border between Poland and Russia. It's a warm summer day, and the largest army ever assembled in European history is crossing into Russian territory. 600,000 men. That's not a typo. 600,000 soldiers from France, Poland, Germany, Italy, and a dozen other nations, all under the command of one man. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, conqueror of Europe, the greatest military genius of his generation. He's 42 years old and at the absolute peak of his power. He's never lost a major campaign. He controls virtually all of continental Europe. He's beaten the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians before. And now he's about to teach Tsar Alexander a final lesson. 6 months later, barely 20,000 of those men will make it back across that river. Alive. This is the story of the greatest military disaster in history. Not a battle lost in an afternoon, but an entire army destroyed across thousands of miles. And 6 months of horror. And the strangest part? Almost none of them died fighting. They froze. They starved. They got sick. They simply vanished into the vastness of Russia. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. Napoleon wasn't stupid. He wasn't reckless. Every decision he made seemed logical at the time. He had good reasons for invading. He had a plan. He had the biggest army in the world. So what went wrong? In this video, you'll discover why Napoleon thought he could conquer Russia in 8 weeks, what specific decisions turned victory into catastrophe, how the Russian winter became a weapon, and why 500,000 men died for essentially nothing. You'll understand how the greatest general of his era made mistakes that seem obvious in hindsight, but made perfect sense at the moment. And you'll see how pride, impatience, and refusing to admit failure can turn a setback into total disaster. To understand how it all went so wrong, we need to understand why Napoleon crossed that river in the first place. Because from his perspective, he didn't really have a choice. Let's go back a few years. By 1812, Napoleon had been at war, on and off, for almost 20 years. He'd won most of it. France controlled Spain, Italy, Germany, Poland. The Austrian Empire was beaten and humiliated. Prussia was essentially a French satellite state. The only major European powers still defying Napoleon were Britain and Russia. Britain was unreachable, protected by the Channel and the most powerful navy in the world, so Napoleon tried to strangle Britain economically. He created the continental system, a massive trade blockade. No European nation was allowed to trade with Britain. The idea was simple: cut off Britain's trade, collapse their economy, force them to negotiate. It was actually working, sort of. British exports were down. The economy was struggling. But there was one enormous problem: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had initially agreed to the continental system after Napoleon defeated Russia in 1807. They'd even been allies, technically. But by 1810, Russia was ignoring the blockade. Russian ports were full of British goods. The Russian economy needed that trade, and Alexander needed the customs revenue. From Napoleon's perspective, this was intolerable. The entire continental system only worked if everyone participated. Russia breaking the blockade was like a crack in a dam. If he let it continue, other countries would follow. The whole strategy would collapse. So he had a choice: accept that Russia was going to trade with Britain, which meant accepting that he couldn't defeat Britain, or make Russia comply by force. Napoleon chose force, but he wasn't planning to conquer Russia. That's crucial to understand. His plan was much simpler: march a massive army into Russia, destroy the Russian army in 1 or 2 big battles near the border, dictate peace terms, and be back in Paris by autumn. 8 weeks, maximum. He'd done it before. In 1805, he'd marched to Austria and crushed them at Austerlitz in 2 months. In 1806, he'd destroyed Prussia in 4 weeks. In 1809, Austria again defeated in 3 months. This was Napoleon's formula. Overwhelming force, rapid movement, one decisive battle, negotiate from strength. Why would Russia be different? And he had the numbers. 600,000 men. The Russian army had maybe 200,000 troops in the western part of the country. The math seemed clear. March in, find them, crush. Them, done. He spent a year preparing. He assembled supplies, ammunition, food, wagons, horses. He built massive supply depots in Poland. He even studied previous invasions of Russia, including Charles X of Sweden's failed campaign a century earlier. He knew it was risky, but he thought he'd learned from others' mistakes. The Russians, meanwhile, had a different plan entirely. They weren't going to fight Napoleon near the border. They knew they'd lose. Instead, they decided to retreat, draw. Napoleon deeper into Russia, stretch his supply lines, avoid major battles, burn crops and towns as they retreated, leaving nothing for the French to use. Scorched earth. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it had one enormous advantage. Russia was huge, unimaginably huge. The distance from the border to Moscow was about 600 miles. That's like walking from Paris to Vienna, except with worse roads, hostile population, and no supplies. If the French wanted to chase the Russian army, they'd have to walk across half a continent to do it. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée started walking. The first few weeks went fine, sort of. The army crossed the Niemen without resistance. They marched into Russia. The Russians retreated exactly as planned. Napoleon's cavalry tried to catch them, force them to fight, but the Russians were always just out of reach. This was annoying, but not yet alarming. Napoleon assumed they'd turn and fight soon. They had to. You can't defend your country by just running away forever. Except they could. And they did. The problems started almost immediately, but they were small at first. The roads were terrible. Russia in 1812 didn't have paved highways. They had dirt tracks that turned to mud when it rained. The army's wagons carrying food and ammunition got stuck. They had to be abandoned. The horses started dying. Not from combat, from exhaustion and bad water. Napoleon had brought about 200,000 horses. Within 3 weeks, 20,000 were dead. The cavalry units, which Napoleon relied on for scouting and chasing the Russians, were already weakening. And the men started getting sick. Dysentery, typhus, fever. The water in Russia wasn't clean. Sanitation in an army of 600,000 men marching through the countryside was not good. Field hospitals filled up. Thousands of men were left behind, too sick to march. By mid-July, just 3 weeks into the campaign, Napoleon had lost about 50,000 men. Not one major battle fought, and he'd already lost 50,000 soldiers. But he pushed on, because the core logic still held: find the Russian army, beat them in battle, end the war. All of these losses would be worth it once he won the decisive battle. The decisive battle just kept not happening. The army reached Vitebsk in late July. Napoleon considered stopping there. They were 300 miles into Russia. Maybe this was far enough. Declare victory, set up a defensive line, negotiate over the winter. His marshals agreed. They were exhausted. The army was exhausted. The supply situation was getting worse. Vitebsk was a good place to stop. Napoleon refused. He'd come to destroy the Russian army. He hadn't even fought them yet. Stopping now would look like weakness. Alexander would never negotiate seriously if Napoleon just stopped in the middle of Russia without winning anything. So they kept marching. This was the first major decision point. Stop at Vitebsk, consolidate, resupply, negotiate from a position of strength even without a battle victory. Or push deeper, find the Russians, force the battle. Napoleon chose deeper. August. The army reached Smolensk, about 400 miles from the border. They finally found Russians willing to fight. There was a battle. The French won, technically. They took the city. But the Russian army retreated in good order. They weren't destroyed, they weren't even badly hurt, and Smolensk was burning. The Russians had set it on fire before retreating, just like they'd burned dozens of towns and villages along the route. The French captured a city of ashes, another decision point. Smolensk was a major city, strategically important. Napoleon could stop here, declare victory, spend the winter in a real city with some supplies. But he'd still accomplished nothing. The Russian army was intact. They could come back in the spring with reinforcements. If Napoleon stopped now, he'd have marched 400 miles into Russia, lost 100,000 men to disease and desertion, captured some burned cities, and achieved exactly zero of his objectives. The logic trap was closing. He'd come too far to stop, but every mile forward made success less likely and retreat more difficult. He chose forward, because Moscow was only 200 miles away. And if he took Moscow, the Russian capital, surely Alexander would have to negotiate. By September, things were getting desperate. The army had been marching for 10 weeks. They'd covered 600 miles. About half the original force was gone, mostly from disease, exhaustion, and desertion. The horses were nearly all dead. Supply wagons couldn't keep up. The men were eating whatever they could find. But finally, the Russians turned to fight. September 7th, 1812, Borodino, about 75 miles west of Moscow. The Russian army, under General Kutuzov, built fortifications and waited. This was it. The decisive battle Napoleon had been chasing for 3 months. It was one of the bloodiest single days in military history up to that point. 70,000 casualties in 12 hours. The French attacked. The Russians defended. Artillery thundered for hours. Charges and countercharges. Men died by the thousands. By nightfall, the French held the field. The Russians retreated. Technically, Napoleon had won, but it wasn't decisive. The Russian army wasn't destroyed. They withdrew in good order. They could fight again. And Napoleon had lost 30,000 men, including some of his best generals. Still, Moscow was open. 7 days. Later, on September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow, the capital of Russia. Surely this was victory. Surely now Alexander would negotiate. Moscow was empty. The population had evacuated. The governor had left. And over the next 3 days, fires broke out across the city, probably started deliberately by Russian authorities. By September 18th, 3/4 of Moscow was burned. Napoleon set up headquarters in the Kremlin, surrounded by a burning city, and waited for peace negotiations. They never came. Tsar Alexander, sitting safely in St. Petersburg, refused to negotiate. His message was clear. As long as a single French soldier remains on Russian soil, there will be no peace. This was Napoleon's nightmare scenario. He'd marched 600 miles, lost half his army, fought the battle he'd been chasing, captured the enemy capital, and achieved nothing. He couldn't stay in Moscow. There wasn't enough food or shelter for the winter. He couldn't advance further. The army was too weak. But retreating would look like defeat. He spent 5 weeks in Moscow waiting for Alexander to blink. Alexander didn't blink. On October 19th, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. This is where catastrophe became apocalypse. The Grande Armée left Moscow with about 100,000 men. They'd started with 600,000. They began the long march back toward Poland and safety. Napoleon planned to take a southern route through areas that hadn't been devastated during the advance, where there might be food and supplies. The Russians had a different plan. Kutuzov's army shadowed the French, blocking the southern routes, forcing them back onto the same road they'd used to advance. The road through devastated countryside. The road where every town was already burned, every field already stripped. There was nothing to eat. The men started starving. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Then those ran out too. Soldiers broke ranks to search for food in abandoned villages. Many never came back. And then winter arrived. Now, here's an important point. The famous Russian winter that destroyed Napoleon's army didn't actually start until November. The first 10 weeks of the retreat happened in normal autumn weather. The army was already disintegrating before the first snow. But when winter did come, it accelerated everything. The temperature dropped to -20°C, -4 Fahrenheit. The soldiers didn't have winter clothing. They'd been told they'd be home by autumn. Many had thrown away their heavy coats to move faster. Men froze to death while sleeping. Frostbite destroyed hands and feet. Anyone who fell behind usually died within hours. And the Cossacks came. Russian light cavalry Cossacks harassed the retreat constantly. They didn't attack the main column, that was still dangerous. They picked off stragglers. Anyone who wandered away from the group, searching for food or just too tired to keep up, disappeared. Thousands of men just vanished. The army began to fall apart as a fighting force. Units lost cohesion. Officers lost control. It became a desperate mob of freezing, starving men trying to get to Poland before they died. On November 26th through 28th, the army reached the Borodino River. It should have been frozen solid, easy to cross. But there'd been a thaw. The ice was broken, the bridges were destroyed, and Russian armies were closing in from multiple directions. French engineers, standing in icy water that killed many of them, built 2 makeshift bridges. The army crossed under constant Russian artillery fire. Thousands drowned. Thousands were left behind when the bridges collapsed. About 20,000 men made it across. December 5th, Napoleon left the army. He transferred command to his Marshal Murat and raced ahead to Paris. Officially, he needed to manage the political situation and raise a new army. Realistically, he was abandoning a dying army to save himself. The retreat continued for another 2 weeks. By December 14th, when the remnants of the Grande Armée finally crossed the Niemen River back into Poland, fewer than 20,000 combat-ready soldiers remained. 600,000 men had crossed that river in June. 20,000 came back. It's hard to even comprehend those numbers. In 6 months, Napoleon lost an army the size of a modern city. Where did they go? About 50,000 died in combat, including Borodino. Maybe 200,000 were captured by the Russians. Most died in captivity. The rest, 350,000 men, died from disease, starvation, exposure, or simply vanished. The horses were completely gone. All 200,000 of them, dead. So what went wrong? How did the greatest military commander of his generation make such catastrophic mistakes? If you're finding this story as fascinating as I did while researching it, a like really helps the channel grow. Just click it quick and let's get back to understanding what happened. Looking back, we can identify specific decision points where Napoleon could have saved his army. At Vitebsk in July, he could have stopped, declared a limited victory, and negotiated. At Smolensk in August, he could have gone into winter quarters in a major city. After Borodino in September, he could have recognized that destroying the Russian army wasn't going to happen and begun an organized retreat while the weather was still good. At each point, he chose to push deeper. Why? Part of it was sunk cost fallacy. He'd invested so much, lost so many men already, that stopping without achieving the objective seemed unacceptable. Retreat would make all those losses meaningless. Part of it was overconfidence. He'd done this successfully a dozen times before. March into enemy territory, win a battle, dictate peace. It had always worked. Why would this time be different? Part of it was misunderstanding the enemy. Napoleon expected the Russians to behave like the Austrians or Prussians, to protect their capital, to value their territory more than continuing the war. He didn't understand that. For Russians, space was their greatest weapon. And part of it was simply bad luck. If the Russians had fought near the border like they'd done in previous wars, Napoleon probably would have won. If the winter had held off another month, more of the army would have made it back. If Alexander had been willing to negotiate after Borodino or Moscow, it would have been remembered as a successful campaign. But all of those factors together created perfect conditions for disaster. The retreat didn't. even accomplish what retreats are supposed to accomplish: saving the army to fight another day. The army was destroyed. The veterans who'd won a dozen campaigns were dead. The mystique of French invincibility was shattered. When news of the disaster reached Europe, Napoleon's enemies saw opportunity. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, everyone he'd defeated before, started forming a new coalition. They smelled blood. Napoleon, to his credit, raised a new army with astonishing speed. By 1813, he had 400,000 fresh troops. But they weren't the veterans who'd marched into Russia. They were teenagers and conscripts, brave but inexperienced. Over the next 2 years, Napoleon fought brilliantly with inferior forces. He won battles he shouldn't have won. But the mathematics were against him. He was facing half of Europe, and he'd lost his best army in the snow. By 1814, Allied armies were in Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. He came back for the 100 Days in 1815, which ended at Waterloo, then final exile to St. Helena, where he died in 1821. All of it traced back to June 1812, when he decided to cross the Niemen River. The Russian campaign broke Napoleon's empire, not immediately, but inevitably. An empire built on military dominance cannot survive losing 600,000 men in 6 months. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility died in the snow, and with it, French dominance of Europe. The irony is that Napoleon didn't even need to conquer Russia. The continental system was already failing. Britain's economy was struggling, but so was everyone else's. Within a few years, the whole blockade strategy would have been abandoned as unworkable anyway. Napoleon marched 600,000 men into Russia to enforce an economic policy that was already obsolete. And what about Russia? They won, obviously. They saved their country, but at enormous cost. Russian casualties during the campaign were probably 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers, plus uncounted civilian deaths from scorched earth and the aftermath. Large parts of Western Russia were devastated, but they proved something important: that Napoleon could be beaten, not with better tactics or superior generals, but with space, time, and willingness to sacrifice anything to survive. It was a lesson that Russia would remember. When Hitler invaded in 1941, the Soviets used the same playbook: retreat, trade space for time, wait for winter, let the vastness of Russia swallow the invaders. It worked again. Some military analysts call Napoleon's Russian campaign the template for defensive warfare against a superior invader. Don't fight on their terms, make them fight on yours, make the country itself the weapon. And the final, strangest irony? Napoleon's disaster became Russia's foundation myth. They'd beaten Napoleon. They'd saved Europe from tyranny. It became a defining moment of Russian identity and pride. Moscow burned, but Russia survived. So, in a twisted way, Napoleon's greatest defeat gave Russia something more valuable than territory: a story of resilience that would echo through history. And it all started because Napoleon couldn't accept a small crack in his continental system, because he thought he could win in 8 weeks, because each decision seemed logical at the time, and each step forward made retreat more unthinkable, until he'd walked himself into catastrophe. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, this is one of the longer videos on the channel, and knowing people actually watch to the end makes all the research worthwhile. If you haven't subscribed yet, there's a new video like this every week: historical stories that deserve to be told properly. Just hit subscribe, it helps more than you'd think. And leave a comment. Did you know the scale of Napoleon's disaster in Russia? What other historical catastrophes should I cover? There's no shortage of terrible decisions in history. Until next time, thanks for watching.